Martin Hayes stepped onto Flight 287 and scanned the aisle. The cabin hummed with activity as passengers stuffed bags into the overhead compartments. He weaved through a few travelers still standing, offering polite excuse-me's, as he made his way toward his seat by the emergency exit a few rows back. Nancy Brooks lowered her magazine slightly, her eyes narrowing as she watched Martin. She had noticed him the moment he boarded, something about his calm and collected demeanor catching her attention. Her gaze followed his movements as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. For reasons she couldn't quite pinpoint, something about him felt off. Nancy's fingers tapped nervously against the armrest as she pretended to read the article before her, though not a single word registered. "Excuse me," Nancy said softly, raising a hand as Jenny, the flight attendant, walked by. Jenny paused, a polite smile on her face. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Nancy tilted her head toward Martin, who had just pulled out a book and was flipping through its pages. Leaning in slightly, she said in a hushed tone, "That man by the emergency exit. Is it really safe to have someone like him sitting there?" Jenny followed her gaze. Martin was sitting quietly, absorbed in his book. Her practiced smile didn't falter. "I assure you, ma'am, all passengers undergo thorough security screening before boarding. Our seating arrangements are in line with safety regulations." Nancy's lips pressed into a tight line. "I just think, with everything you see in the news these days, it's better to be cautious, isn't it?" Jenny's polite smile remained fixed, but her eyes momentarily sharpened. "If there's something specific that's concerning you, please let me know. We're here to ensure all passengers feel safe and comfortable." She gave a small nod before continuing down the aisle. Nancy stared after her, irritation bubbling in her chest. How could the flight attendant dismiss her concerns so easily? Shaking her head, she turned her attention back to Martin, who had set his book down and was now rummaging through his bag. Her mind began to race. What was he looking for? Was he hiding something? She shifted in her seat, unable to take her eyes off him. Unaware of the scrutiny, Martin pulled out a small bottle of medication, checked the label, and slipped it back into his bag. Taking a deep breath, he returned to his book, letting the calm slowly wash over him after a particularly stressful week. Meanwhile, Jenny continued her pre-flight checks, moving toward the back of the plane. As she reached the galley, she leaned close to her colleague, Mark, and whispered, "Keep an eye on seat 18C. The passenger in 22A seems uneasy about him." Mark nodded. "What's the concern?" Jenny shrugged lightly. "Nothing specific, just one of those gut feelings." She tried to shake off the lingering unease. Nancy had been on enough flights to recognize when trouble might be brewing, but it was still too early to say for certain if this was one of those situations. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes fixed on Martin. The engines began to hum louder, signaling that takeoff was imminent. Martin closed his book and turned to look out the window, his expression calm and unbothered. Nancy, however, was far from calm. Her grip tightened on the armrests as a gnawing sense of unease settled in her chest. As the plane taxied down the runway, she leaned back, but her eyes never left Martin. The feeling that something was wrong lingered, and she couldn't shake it. If no one else was going to take action, she might just have to step in herself. Once the plane leveled off after takeoff, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board and providing a brief overview of the flight plan. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers began settling into their routines. Some pulled out laptops, others flipped through books or queued up in-flight movies. Flight attendants made their way down the aisles, checking on passengers and offering refreshments. Martin Hayes relaxed into his seat, turning his gaze to the clouds drifting past the window. Slowly, the tension that had gripped his shoulders began to ease. He unzipped his carry-on bag, retrieving a small water bottle. As he did, he noticed Nancy's eyes on him from his peripheral vision. He hesitated briefly, then brushed it off, assuming she was simply glancing around like other passengers. But a few rows back, Nancy's unease only grew. She watched as Martin carefully zipped up his bag after retrieving the water bottle. What was he hiding in there, she wondered. The way he kept checking the bag as though ensuring its contents were secure seemed suspicious to her. She scanned the cabin, looking at the other passengers. Most were absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to what she saw as a potential threat. Unable to ignore the knot of worry in her chest, Nancy raised her hand to signal Jenny, the flight attendant. Noticing the gesture, Jenny approached with her usual friendly smile. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something you need?" Jenny asked, her tone light and professional. Nancy leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried not to attract attention. "That man up there, near the emergency exit, I've been watching him. He keeps checking that bag of his like he's nervous about what's inside. I really think you should do something about it." Jenny followed Nancy's gaze briefly, then turned back to her with the same calm expression. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but as I mentioned before, unless there's a clear indication of something being amiss, we can't search another passenger's belongings without cause. He hasn't disrupted anything, and his behavior appears normal." Nancy's lips thinned, her frustration evident. "Normal? How can you say that? People like him always act normal until they don't. I've seen it on the news," Nancy said sharply, her voice low but tense. "We can't just sit here and do nothing. What if there's something dangerous in that bag?" Jenny remained composed, her training guiding her response. "We have thorough security measures in place, ma'am. Everyone on this flight has gone through screening. Please try to relax and enjoy the flight. If you notice anything more concrete, don't hesitate to let us know." Nancy huffed and crossed her arms, muttering under her breath, "You people never take things seriously until it's too late." Jenny heard the comment but chose not to respond. Instead, she gave Nancy a polite nod and continued down the aisle, doing her best to shake off the interaction. Her years of experience had prepared her for moments like these, but there was something about Nancy's intensity that unsettled her. A determined glint in her eyes that felt different from the usual nervous passenger. As Jenny passed Martin's seat, she cast a casual glance in his direction. Feeling the subtle shift of attention, Martin looked up and met her eyes. Jenny offered him a polite smile, and he nodded in return, the moment passing without any words. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but Nancy's unease lingered in her mind. Meanwhile, Nancy watched Jenny walk away, frustration boiling inside her. She glanced around the cabin, noticing a few passengers had briefly turned their heads during the exchange, but were now back to their own activities. Their lack of concern annoyed her. How could they all be so complacent? Determined to find someone who would take her concerns seriously, Nancy leaned toward her seatmate, a middle-aged woman engrossed in a magazine. "Excuse me," Nancy whispered. "Did you notice that man near the exit? Doesn't he seem off to you?" The woman looked up, startled by the sudden question. She followed Nancy's gaze toward Martin, who was calmly flipping through the pages of his book. "I don't know," she replied cautiously. "He looks fine to me. What's the issue?" Nancy frowned, irritation flickering across her face. "He's been acting suspicious since we boarded. Keeps checking his bag like he's hiding something. I told the flight attendant, but they don't seem to care. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry?" The woman glanced at Martin again, then back at Nancy. "Maybe," she said hesitantly, "but I think if there were really a problem, the crew would be handling it. I'm sure it's nothing." She turned back to her magazine, her tone dismissive. Nancy clenched her jaw, the frustration mounting. It was clear to her now. If no one else was going to take this seriously, she would have to. She fixed her gaze on Martin, determined not to let him out of her sight. She watched his every movement, waiting for something, anything, that would justify her growing suspicions. Unaware of the scrutiny, Martin remained absorbed in his book, pausing occasionally to take a sip from his water bottle. He was content, his mind wandering to thoughts of the meeting awaiting him in Los Angeles and the complex case he was preparing to present. The steady hum of the plane's engines provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. He had no idea that just a few rows behind him, someone's mounting paranoia was about to escalate into something far more disruptive. Nancy's unease deepened with every passing minute. Her mind replayed a carousel of news stories and worst-case scenarios, each adding weight to her growing fears. Her pulse quickened, her thoughts swirling with the certainty that danger was near. She resolved to keep watching, waiting for Martin to make one wrong move. If he did, she would be the first to act. The cabin of Flight 287 was filled with the familiar sounds of a long-haul journey. The steady hum of the engines, the soft rustling of magazine pages, and the occasional clink of the drink cart. Most passengers were relaxed, either engrossed in their in-flight entertainment or nodding off. But Nancy Brooks sat rigid in her seat, her eyes locked on Martin Hayes. Her irritation and suspicion grew with each passing moment. Every time Martin reached down to check his bag, Nancy felt her anxiety spike. Her cheeks flushed with heat, her thoughts racing. This wasn't normal, she thought. Nobody checks their bag that often, unless they're hiding something. She felt a gnawing sense of responsibility to do something, but each time she considered confronting him directly, doubt crept in. What if he reacts badly? What if I'm wrong? Unable to hold back any longer, Nancy leaned toward the elderly man sitting beside her. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Have you noticed the man near the emergency exit? He keeps checking his bag. Doesn't that seem suspicious to you?" The elderly man glanced up from his crossword puzzle, peering at her through his glasses. He followed her gaze toward Martin, but quickly returned his focus to his puzzle. "I hadn't noticed anything unusual," he said dismissively. "I'm sure it's nothing." Nancy's frustration surged. How can everyone be so blind? She thought. She scanned the cabin, hoping to find someone else who might share her concern. Her eyes landed on a young woman seated across the aisle. The woman appeared to be watching Martin, her expression curious but unalarmed. Nancy leaned toward her, speaking in a hushed tone. "Excuse me, do you see that man near the exit? Doesn't he seem off to you, like he's hiding something?" The young woman glanced at Martin, then back at Nancy, her polite smile tinged with hesitation. "I don't know," she said carefully. "He looks like he's just reading. Is there something wrong?" Nancy's patience snapped. "Yes, there is," she said, her voice tight with irritation. "He's been acting strange since we boarded. Keeps checking that bag of his like there's something dangerous in it. I've told the flight attendant, but no one's doing anything about it." The young woman shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to disengage. "Maybe it's best to leave it to the crew. They're trained for situations like this, aren't they?" Nancy's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "What if it's too late by then?" she demanded. "What if something happens that we could have stopped? I'm not the only one who feels this way." Her tone was firm, an attempt to rally support from those around her. A few passengers turned their heads to look at Martin, who remained blissfully unaware of the scrutiny. He sat calmly, absorbed in his book, his posture utterly relaxed. Jenny, the flight attendant, noticed the increasing number of passengers turning their heads and murmuring, their attention drawn toward Nancy's seat. She moved briskly toward Nancy, her expression calm but her tone low and firm. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. We don't want to disturb the other passengers. What seems to be the issue?" Nancy gestured toward Martin, her expression set with determination. "I've been telling you. That man is acting suspiciously. He keeps checking his bag over and over. He's up to something, I know it." Jenny took a steadying breath, maintaining her professionalism. "Ma'am, as I've explained before, we cannot take action without concrete evidence of a threat. Please try to remain calm. I assure you, we are monitoring the situation." Nancy's voice rose, cutting through the low hum of the cabin. "Monitoring? What does that even mean? Are you just going to sit there and wait for something terrible to happen? That's not good enough." Passengers began to murmur. Some looked concerned, others irritated by the disruption. Martin finally looked up, sensing the tension that had spread through the cabin. His eyes met Nancy's for a moment, confusion flickering across his face. Jenny noticed the growing unease among the passengers and knew she had to act quickly to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," she said, her voice calm but firm. "However, raising your voice and alarming other passengers isn't going to help. Please lower your voice, or I'll have to involve the captain." Nancy abruptly stood, her face flushed with anger. "No, you don't understand. You're all blind. Something is wrong, and I'm not going to sit here and do nothing." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the cabin's relative quiet. More heads turned, and whispers began to spread. Jenny placed a gentle hand on Nancy's arm, attempting to guide her back into her seat. "Ma'am, please sit down. Let's talk about this calmly." Nancy shook Jenny's hand off, pointing directly at Martin. "He's hiding something. I demand that his bag be searched right now." Martin's eyes widened slightly. He glanced around at the gathering crowd before turning his gaze back to Nancy. Slowly, he closed his book and set it down on his lap. His voice was measured, calm, and deliberately quiet. "Ma'am, I assure you, there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight like everyone else." Nancy's eyes burned with indignation. "Peaceful flight? You expect us to believe that? What are you hiding in there?" Jenny stepped between Martin and Nancy, her voice steady but commanding. "That's enough. We're not going to have this conversation here. Ma'am, please take your seat. Sir, thank you for your patience." Turning to address the rest of the passengers, Jenny raised her voice just enough to be heard over the growing murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. There is no cause for alarm. Kindly return to your seats." The murmuring grew louder, and Jenny knew she had to act quickly before things spiraled further out of control. She'd signaled to another flight attendant, who joined her to help manage the situation. Together, they gently but firmly guided Nancy back into her seat. Despite their efforts, Nancy continued to mutter angrily under her breath, her frustration clearly not abated. Martin remained seated, his face a picture of composure. He watched quietly as Nancy was finally secured in her seat, her glare still fixed on him with unrelenting distrust. Though he could feel the tension thicken the air, he stayed calm, refusing to let the moment rattle him. Martin knew better than to engage, especially with so many eyes on them. Instead, he picked up his book, flipping to the page where he had left off, and began reading again. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the mounting tension around him. At the front of the cabin, Jenny gave the passengers a reassuring smile, hoping to ease the unease spreading among them. She then moved to the galley to contact the captain. She needed to inform him of the situation just in case it escalated further. Picking up the intercom phone, she cast a quick glance back toward Martin, who appeared composed, and Nancy, whose eyes still burned with suspicion. Jenny sighed. This was going to be a long flight. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but the tension was unmistakable. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, some whispering to one another, while others pretended to focus on their books or screens. Nancy sat stiffly in her seat, fuming. She couldn't comprehend why no one else was taking her seriously. She glanced around, catching snippets of murmured conversations. "They're all talking about me," she thought bitterly. But it didn't matter. She was convinced she was right. Nancy's eyes flicked back to Martin. He sat there reading, unbothered by the disruption she had caused. His calmness only irritated her further. How can he sit there so composed? She thought. If he weren't hiding something, he'd be nervous like everyone else. Her thoughts churned. If no one else will act, then I'll have to handle this myself. Martin shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the weight of Nancy's gaze. He glanced up briefly, catching her staring at him with narrowed eyes and a set jaw. He recognized that look all too well. The look of someone convinced they'd uncovered a threat, someone who wouldn't back down. Sighing quietly, he turned back to his book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Things are about to get worse, he thought. Nancy couldn't take it anymore. Her patience snapped. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood abruptly, striding down the aisle toward Martin with quick, determined steps. Passengers turned their heads to watch, their curiosity piqued as the cabin fell quieter. Martin looked up, sensing her approach. Calmly, he set his book down on his lap and met her fiery gaze. "You!" Nancy's voice rang out, cutting through the murmurs. "I want to know what's in that bag right now." She pointed at him, her finger trembling with anger. Martin remained composed. "Ma'am, there's nothing in this bag that concerns you," he said evenly, his voice low and measured. "Please, sit down. You're causing a scene." Jenny rushed down the aisle, her face a mix of concern and resolve. "Ma'am, please, you need to return to your seat," she said, placing a gentle hand on Nancy's arm. "You're disturbing the other passengers." Nancy shook off Jenny's hand, her attention entirely fixed on Martin. "No, I won't sit down until he opens that bag. I know he's hiding something dangerous. I'm not going to let this plane be put in danger because everyone else is too blind to see the truth." Martin glanced at Jenny, who was struggling to maintain her composure as the situation spiraled further out of control. He could see the worry in her eyes, the mounting fear that this was on the verge of becoming something much more serious. Martin kept his voice calm and controlled. "Ma'am, my bag only contains personal items. I assure you, there's nothing here that poses a threat to anyone." Nancy let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Promises? You think we're just supposed to take your word for it? You're not fooling anyone. I've been watching you since the moment you boarded. You keep checking that bag like you're worried someone will figure out what's inside. Well, I'm not afraid to call you out." Jenny stepped between Nancy and Martin, her body forming a barrier. Her voice was firm, authoritative. "That's enough. Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately. If you continue disrupting the flight, I will have no choice but to involve the captain." By now, the confrontation had captured the attention of nearly everyone on board. Passengers leaned into the aisle for a better view, while others whispered to their neighbors, speculating about what was going on. Despite the growing commotion, Martin stayed seated, his expression calm, his hands resting lightly on his book. He knew that any move he made could be misinterpreted and might escalate the situation further. Nancy ignored Jenny's warning, her gaze locked on Martin like a hawk zeroing in on its prey. "I'm not sitting down until someone does something. If no one's going to listen, I'll make sure everyone knows what's really going on here." Her voice rose with each word, her face flushed with anger. Jenny turned to Martin, her voice lower and more conciliatory. "Sir, I'm so sorry to ask this, but could you please show her the contents of your bag? If she sees there's nothing to worry about, maybe we can resolve this peacefully." Martin's eyes flicked from Jenny to Nancy, whose determined scowl made it clear she wouldn't back down. He let out a long breath before nodding slowly. "Fine, if it helps keep the peace." Reaching down, Martin unzipped his carry-on bag and carefully pulled out a small, clear plastic case containing his medication. Holding it up for both Jenny and Nancy to see, he said, "This is what's in my bag. It's medication. I have a heart condition, and I need to keep this with me at all times." Jenny nodded, visibly relieved. "There, you see? There's nothing dangerous here. Let's put this behind us and finish the flight peacefully." But Nancy's face twisted in disbelief. She shook her head and took a step closer to Martin. No, that can't be it. That's not everything. You're lying." "You have to be." Martin's calm demeanor remained unchanged. "Ma'am, I'm not lying. This is the truth. Please sit down." Nancy's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for support among the other passengers. "Can't you all see? He's trying to trick us. This isn't right. We have to search him properly." Jenny stepped forward again, her voice sharper now. "Ma'am, that's enough. Please, return to your seat now, or I will be forced to take further action." Nancy ignored her. In a sudden motion, she reached out as if to grab Martin's bag. Before she could, Martin gently but firmly took hold of her wrist, stopping her. His grip was steady, but his expression remained calm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice even, "please don't do this. There's no need for this kind of behavior." Nancy yanked her hand back, her eyes wide with alarm. "You're all in on it, aren't you? You're all protecting him," she accused, her voice climbing into hysteria as she backed away. Jenny quickly signaled another flight attendant, who moved toward them with purpose. "Ma'am, please come with us," the second attendant said, her tone firm yet calm. "We need to have a word with you at the back of the plane." Nancy hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin, scanning the faces now fully focused on her. Some passengers looked on with sympathy, while others wore expressions of disapproval. Realizing she had no support and faced the unwavering resolve of the flight attendants, Nancy finally relented. She turned and began walking toward the back of the plane, her steps slow and reluctant. Martin watched her go, aware of the many eyes now shifting to him. He calmly picked up his book, turning back to the page he'd been reading before the confrontation began. The tension in the cabin was thick, the murmurs of whispered conversations loud and unrelenting. Yet Martin kept his focus on the text, determined not to let the weight of the situation press down on him. He had faced worse before. As Jenny escorted Nancy away, she glanced back at Martin, offering him a subtle nod of thanks. Martin returned the gesture with a slight incline of his head, a silent acknowledgement of the tension they both were managing. While the immediate threat of escalation had passed, he knew the situation wasn't entirely over. For now, however, the cabin had begun to settle as the plane soared steadily through the clouds, heading west. The atmosphere remained taut, like a string pulled too tight and ready to snap. Passengers had returned to their seats, but many still cast furtive glances toward the back of the plane where Nancy had been escorted. The murmur of voices carried speculation and unease, filling the cabin with a subdued but palpable tension. Martin felt the weight of their stares on him, but he kept his eyes trained on his book, his calm exterior unbroken. At the rear of the plane, Nancy sat in a seat reserved for the flight crew, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face flushed with anger. Jenny stood beside her, speaking in a low, measured tone, trying to reason with her. "Ma'am, I understand that you're concerned," Jenny said gently, "but Mr. Hayes showed us his medication. There's no indication that he poses any kind of threat. Please, try to calm down. Right now, your behavior is causing more alarm than anything else." Nancy shook her head, her eyes blazing with frustration. "You don't get it. You don't see it. He's dangerous. I know it. And if you won't do something, then I will." Her voice, though hushed, carried an unmistakable edge of defiance. Her words were sharp, each one laced with conviction. "People like him always have a story, always an excuse, but I see through it." Jenny sighed quietly, recognizing the futility of trying to reason further. She turned toward Jim, the other flight attendant, standing nearby, who nodded in silent acknowledgement, ready to step in if necessary. "Ma'am," Jim said, his tone firm but calm, "we need you to remain composed for the rest of the flight. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement when we land." Nancy's eyes widened in alarm. She leaned back in her seat, momentarily silent, before muttering under her breath, "You'll regret not listening to me." Jenny decided it was best to leave Nancy with Jim for now. She needed to return to the aisle, check on the other passengers, and ensure the situation didn't escalate further. As she approached Martin, she noticed how the other passengers quickly averted their gazes, pretending they hadn't been staring. Stopping beside him, she leaned in slightly. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, her voice carrying an apologetic tone, "I'm so sorry for the disturbance. Is there anything you need?" Martin looked up from his book and shook his head. "No, thank you. I understand these things happen. I appreciate how you're handling it." Jenny hesitated, then spoke in an even quieter voice, ensuring only Martin could hear her. "I just wanted to make sure there's no misunderstanding. If you need anything, please let us know. We want to ensure your comfort and safety, as well as everyone else's." Martin nodded, recognizing the sincerity in her words. "Thank you. I just want to get to Los Angeles without any more trouble." Jenny gave him a small, reassuring smile before continuing down the aisle to check on the other passengers. Martin watched her go, then returned his attention to his book, trying to refocus. But the atmosphere in the cabin made it nearly impossible. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the whispers following his every move. Martin knew he had to do something to ease the unease growing around him. He looked around, assessing the mood of the passengers. After a deep breath, he stood, carefully placing his book on his seat. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his badge, a step he rarely took, but one he felt was necessary to defuse the situation. Walking down the aisle, Martin stopped next to Jenny. His voice was calm, but carried enough weight to command attention. "Excuse me," he began, his tone loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "May I have everyone's attention for a moment?" The murmurs ceased, and heads turned toward him. The cabin fell silent. Holding up his badge for all to see, Martin continued, "My name is Detective Martin Hayes. I'm an undercover police detective with the New York Police Department. I've been on assignment, and the medication in my bag is for a heart condition. I apologize if my behavior caused any concern, but I want to assure you there is no threat here." For a moment, the cabin remained silent. Then, relief washed over some passengers' faces. A few exchanged glances, nodding slowly, while others appeared surprised. Martin's calm, authoritative tone seemed to soothe much of the tension in the air. Jenny gave him a small nod of appreciation, silently thanking him for taking steps to defuse the situation. But just as the atmosphere began to settle, Nancy's voice rang out from the back of the plane, loud and indignant. "You're lying. This is just a cover. How do we know that badge is real? How do we know you're not using that badge to smuggle something dangerous?" Nancy demanded, her voice sharp and trembling. Martin turned to face her, his expression steady and unflinching. "Ma'am," he said, his tone calm and measured. "If you'd like, you can call my department to verify my identity. The number is on the back of the badge. I'm not here to cause harm. I'm just doing my job and trying to get to my destination safely." Nancy's face flushed with anger, her eyes wild. "No! I don't believe you. This is all a trick. You can't fool me." The tension in the cabin spiked again, an invisible wave of unease washing over the passengers. Martin could see the fear in Nancy's eyes, the panic that had taken hold and wouldn't release her. He realized that no amount of reasoning would convince her, but he also knew he needed to stay calm to keep the situation under control. "Ma'am," Martin said softly, his voice steady and compassionate. "I understand you're scared, but I promise you there's nothing to fear from me. Let's just finish this flight without any more trouble. When we land, you're welcome to have the authorities verify everything." Nancy's head shook furiously, her breathing uneven and rapid. Her voice quavered as she stammered, No, I won't wait. I won't sit here and do nothing while you... Her words faltered, her voice trailing off into silence. Jenny stepped forward, her tone firm but calm. "Ma'am, please sit down. We've spoken with Mr. Hayes, and everything is under control. We need you to stay calm." Nancy glanced around the cabin, her eyes darting to the faces of the passengers who had been watching her every move. Some looked on with concern, others with thinly veiled disapproval. She realized, slowly, that she had no support, no allies. She was alone. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank back into her seat, still shaking her head, her breathing uneven. Martin watched her for a moment, then turned to Jenny. "Thank you," he said quietly. He walked back to his seat, feeling the eyes of the passengers on him, but choosing to ignore them. Sitting down, he picked up his book and opened it to where he had left off, though his mind was far from the words on the page. For a few minutes, the flight continued in silence. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but no longer teetered on the edge of chaos. Slowly, passengers began to relax, turning back to their movies, books, and quiet conversations. Jenny moved quietly through the aisle, ensuring everyone was settled. Her gaze occasionally flicked between Martin and Nancy, ready to intervene if necessary. At the back of the plane, Nancy sat stiffly, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the silent judgment in their gazes. Why couldn't they see what she saw, she wondered. Why did they trust him so easily? But she couldn't fight anymore. She was alone in her fear, and for now she had no choice but to wait until they landed. Martin sat quietly, his eyes scanning the pages of his book, but his mind remained on high alert. He was attuned to the slightest movement or sound around him, knowing this situation wasn't truly over. While he hoped the worst had passed, the hours left in the flight stretched ahead like an uncertain horizon. He focused on his breathing, keeping it steady, working to calm his heart rate and maintain composure. Anything could still happen. The cabin of Flight 287 remained tense in the aftermath of Martin's revelation. Some passengers had returned to their routines, settling back into books, screens, or quiet conversations. But others continued to steal wary glances at him, their unease lingering. At the back of the plane, Nancy sat isolated, her arms crossed and her expression dark with frustration and disbelief. The murmur of conversation in the cabin was low and cautious, as if passengers feared saying too much might reignite the tension. Jenny moved carefully through the aisles, offering quiet reassurances to those who seemed unsettled. She worked to maintain a sense of normalcy, but she could feel the ripple of unease radiating from the rear of the plane, where Nancy sat, her eyes burning with stubborn defiance. At the back of the cabin, Jim kept a close watch on Nancy. She sat rigidly, her body language a clear reflection of her anger and fear. Jim had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something different about her intensity. It was unnerving. As Jenny approached, Jim leaned in, speaking quietly. "She's still agitated," he said. "I don't think she's going to calm down anytime soon." Jenny nodded, casting a quick glance at Nancy, whose expression remained locked in defiance. "I know," she replied. "We need to make sure she doesn't cause any more disturbances. Can you stay with her and try to keep her calm? I'll check in with the captain to see if we need to take any additional precautions." Jim gave a short nod. "I'll do my best." Jenny moved toward the front of the plane and entered the cockpit. Captain Samuel Harris turned slightly in his seat, his expression serious as he addressed her. "What's the situation, Jenny?" "We've managed to de-escalate things for now," she replied. "But the woman, Nancy, is still agitated. She doesn't believe Martin is telling the truth, even though he's shown his badge and explained everything. I'm concerned she might try something else." The captain frowned, his face grave. "We can't afford another outburst. It could cause a panic. If necessary, we may have to restrain her to ensure the safety of everyone on board." Jenny nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I'll keep an eye on her. Jim's with her now, doing his best to keep her calm. We'll do everything we can to avoid using restraints, but we'll be ready if it comes to that." Captain Harris gave a small, firm nod. "Keep me updated. If things get out of hand, we'll notify air traffic control and have security waiting when we land." Jenny left the cockpit, her mind racing through contingency plans. She couldn't let things escalate again, not with so many lives depending on a peaceful resolution. As she walked back through the cabin, she felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. Keeping Nancy calm was paramount, but she knew it would be no easy task. Jenny made her way to the rear of the plane, where Jim stood vigil near Nancy's seat. As she approached, Nancy looked up, her eyes flashing with defiance. "So, are you here to apologize? To admit that I'm right?" Nancy demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. Jenny shook her head, keeping her voice calm yet firm. "No, ma'am. I'm here to check on you and make sure you're okay. We need everyone to stay calm and cooperative so we can reach our destination safely." Nancy's jaw tightened. "Cooperative? You mean compliant? You want me to just sit here and do nothing while that man goes through with whatever plan he has? I won't do it. I can't believe you're all falling for his lies." Jenny took a steadying breath. "Mr. Hayes is not lying, ma'am. He's shown us his credentials, and there's nothing to suggest he's a threat. However, your behavior is causing concern among the other passengers. We need you to remain calm and stay in your seat. If you can't do that, we'll have to take further measures." Nancy's eyes widened, her tone growing sharper. "Further measures? What are you going to do, arrest me? I'm the one trying to keep everyone safe." Jenny met Nancy's glare steadily, her voice unwavering. "Ma'am, we are responsible for the safety of everyone on this flight. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we may have to restrain you for the remainder of the flight. Please, just stay calm and remain in your seat." Nancy's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in her expression. A moment of hesitation. Whatever it was, it seemed to dampen her fire. She leaned back in her seat, still seething, but her voice dropped to a muttered, "Fine. But if something happens, it's on you, all of you." Jenny nodded, relieved that Nancy seemed to be complying, at least for the moment. She'd signaled to Jim to remain vigilant before moving back into the aisle. She'd resumed her duties, checking on passengers, offering polite smiles and doing her best to project a sense of calm reassurance. The tension in the cabin still lingered like an unspoken weight, but it no longer felt on the brink of boiling over. As Jenny moved toward the front of the plane, Martin watched her approach. From his seat, he had been quietly observing the unfolding situation, attuned to every movement and every shift in the atmosphere. He could see the strain in Jenny's expression, the way her eyes flicked between him and the back of the plane. When she reached his seat, Martin looked up, his face composed. "How's it going back there?" he asked softly. Jenny sighed, her voice low but honest. "She's still upset, but she's staying in her seat for now. We're keeping a close watch. I'm sorry this has caused you so much trouble. We're doing our best to manage the situation." Martin nodded, his expression steady. "I know you are. You're handling it well. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Jenny gave him a small, appreciative smile. "Just stay calm. The less we escalate, the better." Martin returned to his book, but his senses remained heightened. He could still feel the lingering tension in the air, a subtle, ever-present undercurrent that threatened to resurface at any moment. While he hoped the situation would remain quiet until they landed, he knew this wasn't truly over. At the back of the plane, Nancy sat rigidly in her seat, her mind racing. She couldn't believe that everyone had sided with Martin, dismissing the danger she saw so clearly. Her anger simmered just below the surface, but she forced herself to remain composed, knowing another outburst would only worsen things for her. Nearby, Jim kept a close watch on Nancy. He could see the turmoil in her expression, the way her hands gripped the armrests tightly, as if holding herself back from doing something drastic. He stayed ready, prepared to step in if necessary. Minutes passed, stretching into an hour, as the flight settled into a tense rhythm. Passengers quietly attended to their activities, their voices low and conversations muted. Jenny continued her rounds, her watchful gaze alternating between Martin and Nancy. She was acutely aware that she was the thin line keeping the peace. Finally, Jenny approached Jim and leaned in, her voice a whisper. "I think we're okay for now. Just keep watch and let me know if anything changes." Jim nodded, his focus unwavering. "Will do." Jenny turned and walked away, her mind still preoccupied with the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. She knew the tension could flare up again at any moment, but for now they were managing. The plane continued its steady journey through the sky, carrying its passengers towards their destination, each of them silently hoping the unease wouldn't resurface. Nancy remained in her seat, her thoughts circling back to Martin and the threat she believed he posed. Her anger bubbled below the surface, simmering but contained, waiting for the smallest spark to reignite it. Meanwhile, Martin, though outwardly calm, stayed vigilant. He understood that his ability to remain composed was crucial to preserving the fragile peace. The hour dragged on, the cabin settling into an uneasy quiet. Finally, the soft ding of the seatbelt sign illuminated, signaling the plane's descent. Relief rippled through the passengers, each one silently hoping for a smooth landing, both literally and figuratively. Captain Harris's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, announcing their approach to Los Angeles. Passengers began to stir in their seats, some stretching, others packing away laptops and books in preparation for landing. The tension that had weighed heavily on the cabin throughout the flight seemed to lighten as the journey neared its end. Martin Hayes felt the plane tilt slightly as it began its descent. He closed his book and carefully tucked it back into his carry-on bag, double-checking that his medication was safely secured. His eyes flicked briefly toward the back of the plane, where Nancy sat under Jim's watchful eye. She had remained quiet since her last outburst, but Martin could tell by her rigid posture and the way her eyes darted nervously around that she was anything but calm. Jenny made her final walk down the aisle, ensuring passengers were buckled in and ready for landing. As she reached Martin's seat, she paused and offered him a small, reassuring smile. "We're almost there," she said quietly. "Thank you for your patience." Martin nodded. "I just want to get through this without any more issues. You've handled everything well." Jenny nodded back, appreciating his calm demeanor. "Let's hope things stay quiet until we're on the ground." As Jenny continued down the aisle, her gaze swept over the passengers, checking for any signs of trouble. Near the back, she noticed Jim signaling her. Her heart sank slightly as she quickened her pace to meet him. When she reached him, Jim leaned in close, speaking in a low voice. "Nancy's been muttering to herself. She's getting agitated again. We need to be ready in case she tries something." Jenny glanced at Nancy. She was staring straight ahead, her face flushed with frustration, her body stiff with tension. Jenny knelt beside her, keeping her tone soft but firm. "Ma'am, we're about to land. I need you to stay calm and remain in your seat. We're almost there." Nancy's eyes flicked toward Jenny, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This isn't over. I'm not letting him get away with whatever he's planning. You'll see. You'll all see." A chill ran through Jenny, but she maintained a calm expression and forced a small smile. "Please, just stay seated until we land. Everything will be addressed once we're on the ground." Nancy didn't respond. Her jaw set and her gaze fixed forward, but she didn't make any move to get up either. Jenny exhaled slowly, rose to her feet, and returned to her station. She signaled Jim to keep a close watch on Nancy as the plane continued its descent, carrying everyone closer to the tense conclusion of their journey. The plane continued its descent, the sprawling city of Los Angeles coming into view below. Jenny silently hoped that once they landed, everything would proceed without incident. As the wheels touched down, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the passengers. The usual sounds of unbuckling seatbelts and rustling bags filled the cabin. Martin remained seated, knowing there was no reason to rush. He waited as others stood, retrieving their luggage from the overhead compartments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Harris's voice echoed through the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Welcome to Los Angeles. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off and the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate. We appreciate your cooperation and hope you have a pleasant stay." Martin felt the plane taxiing toward the gate. He glanced out the window, watching the airport crew preparing for their arrival. Jenny approached him, her expression calm but purposeful. "We've contacted airport security," she said softly. "They'll be waiting when we reach the gate." Martin nodded. "That's probably for the best, thank you." As the plane came to a halt and the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers eagerly stood, gathering their belongings and lining up to disembark. Jenny and Jim positioned themselves near Nancy, ready to step in if necessary. Martin remained seated, knowing he would be among the last to leave. Around him, he could hear the mix of murmured voices, some relieved, others filled with curiosity about the earlier drama. The cabin door opened and two uniformed security officers stepped inside. Jenny motioned for them to head to the back of the plane, where Nancy sat rigidly in her seat. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm yet firm demeanor, approached her, speaking in a low, authoritative tone. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," he said. "We'd like to have a word with you about the incident during the flight." Nancy's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything wrong. It's him. He's the one you should be arresting." Her hand shot out, pointing wildly in Martin's direction. The officer remained composed, his tone steady. "Ma'am, we just need to speak with you. If you could please come with us, we can sort everything out." Nancy abruptly stood, her voice rising as her anger boiled over. You're all in on it. You're protecting him. I'm the only one who sees the truth." The second officer, a woman with a firm yet steady hand, gently but decisively took hold of Nancy's arm. "Ma'am, we need you to remain calm," she said evenly. "Please come with us, and we'll handle everything appropriately." Nancy tried to pull away, her voice rising into a shrill protest. "No! This isn't right. You can't do this." The officers, unfazed by her outburst, maintained their composure as they guided her toward the exit. Her protests echoed through the cabin, the sound sharp and jarring against the otherwise subdued atmosphere. Passengers watched silently, their expressions ranging from shock to relief that the situation was finally being resolved. Jenny followed close behind, her focus on ensuring everything remained under control. Martin stayed in his seat, watching as Nancy was escorted off the plane. He could feel the lingering stares of other passengers on him, but he ignored them, instead observing the steady professionalism of the officers as they handled the situation. After a moment, Jenny returned to Martin's side, her expression a mix of relief and fatigue. "They'll take her to a holding area for questioning," she said softly. "We've also informed the authorities about the situation, so everything will be thoroughly reviewed." Martin nodded. "Thank you. You've handled all of this with professionalism, and I appreciate it." Jenny offered a small smile. "Just doing my job. I'm glad we got through this without more issues." As the last of the passengers began to disembark, Martin stood, retrieving his carry-on bag. He moved down the aisle, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He nodded to Jenny one last time before stepping off the plane. The cool air of the jet bridge greeted him as he walked toward the terminal. In the terminal, Martin's gaze followed Nancy as the officers escorted her away. Her voice echoed through the space, sharp and argumentative, bouncing off the walls. He watched as they guided her toward a secure area, her protests gradually fading as she disappeared from sight. Martin turned and headed towards baggage claim, his steps steady and deliberate. The events of the flight replayed in his mind like a looping tape. He knew he had done his best to handle the situation, but the weight of being unjustly accused still clung to him. As he reached the baggage claim area, Martin took a deep breath, grounding himself. He had faced worse in his line of work, but the sting of the day's events lingered nonetheless. For now, he focused on what came next, leaving the tension of the flight behind him. Martin Hayes took a deep breath, ready to leave the day's events behind him. The passengers of Flight 287 filtered out into the terminal, their voices low as they spoke quietly among themselves. A few glanced in the direction where Nancy had been escorted, her earlier outbursts still fresh in their minds. The tension of the flight was dissipating, replaced by the bustle of the airport and the anticipation of reaching their destinations. For Martin, the day wasn't over. He knew there would be reports to file, questions to answer, and time spent reflecting on the events that had unfolded. But for now, he let the noise and motion of the airport wash over him, a comforting reminder that life moved forward, even after moments of conflict and misunderstanding. As he walked toward the exit, Martin felt a renewed sense of resolve. The day had been difficult, fraught with tension and false accusations, but he had met it with dignity and professionalism. And in the end, that was all anyone could do: face challenges with integrity and move forward.